It is now my pleasure to introduce Carol Vandermeulen, our speaker for tonight. Carol is a graduate from the UC A&R Master Gardener Program in 2005. She has over 2,000 volunteer hours, including the building and managing of the Livermore Earth-Friendly Demonstration Garden. She has spoken on various horticultural, landscape design, and management topics, as well as irrigation and water conservation. Outside the Master Gardener Program, Carol is a landscape designer and horticultural consultant with various certifications and qualifications. Take it away, Carol.
Thanks, Sandy. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining me. So what is sheet mulching? Sheet mulching is a technique of laying cardboard or newspaper or some sort of barrier material over an existing lawn or plot of weeds or such, and then topping it off with layers of compost and wood mulch. These layers suppress the weed growth and convert that plant material, whether it be the lawn, the weeds, or whatever, to compost and nitrogen, giving you a healthier soil and healthier future plants. Rather than sending the lawn to the dumps, this takes advantage of the topsoil and the soil life that exists below the ground and the nitrogen in the lawn to build the soil for this new garden and new plants. While this process can be done in a weekend, it does take some prep, and you'll have best results with some planning. How long does it take? It depends on your effort. If you install it and do nothing, and believe me, it's very possible to do this, it can take 6 to 10 months. But if you regularly water and keep the weeds down, add extra mulch as needed, then you can be ready to plant in 4 to 6 weeks. In this time of drought, this could be done. It could be done now in preparation for fall planting. Summer planting really would require more water to establish the plant, so it's usually recommended to do the planting in the fall. So this is a great way to get the area all set up and ready for replanting in the fall. So why would you want a sheet mulch? In our summer dry climate, lawn is really not the best use of our valuable resource, water, even in a non-drought year, but especially in years like this year, in these times where water shortages are going to require us to cut back, we need to rethink what we spend our valuable resource on. Typically, a turf lawn uses 80 to 100% of the water that is evaporated and transpired. You need to replace 80 to 100% of the water that's transpired to maintain a healthy lawn. Some of the new lawns that are like the Buffalo Verde and the Agrostis, they use less water, but they're still using 60 to 70% of the water still need 60 to 70% of the water replaced. Whereas if you were to replace it with some shrubs and perennials, your typical low water and even moderate water plants, they only need 20 to 60% of the water replaced. In addition to that, instead of doing spray irrigation where you pretty much lose immediately 25% of evaporation, you're watering more directly into the soil. So there's a lot less water lost that way too. In addition, it also avoids the labor of digging out the lawn. If you're doing this yourself, digging out the lawn is a daunting task. So sheet mulching is a much easier process to convert that lawn space over to a garden space, a soil ready to be planted. So the first step is to get the site prepared. First, remove all the woody plant material, bigger weeds, any shrubs, probably also all the more noxious weeds such as Bermuda grass, nutgrass, blackberries, oxalis, or horsetail. Just as a side note, sheet mulching is really not effective for killing off Bermuda grass lawn. It can be done. I've done it. But it takes twice as much material and it pretty much comes back year after year. I did my sheet mulching almost 15 years ago and I still see sprigs of Bermuda grass coming up. So if you're looking for an easy way to get rid of your Bermuda grass, sheet mulching is probably not your first choice. Second part of site preparation is installing any pathways or dry creek beds, mainly because it makes no sense to sheet mulch those areas because you're not going to be planting in those areas. So kind of dig them out now and use that soil or dirt that you're using to build up mounds and such. You want to mow whatever lawn is left, leaving those lawn clippings in place, i.e. keeping all that nitrogen there. Water the area very well for the week prior if possible, especially if it was a dead weed plot before or a dried out lawn, but ideally not necessarily the day of sheet mulching. This activates the soil. This water is actually really almost the most critical part of this sheet mulching process because water is what activates the life in the soil and actually starts the decomposition process. In addition, you want to flag your sprinkler heads and decide what you're going to do with them. Either if you're going to convert those heads, you want to just flag them so that you can convert them over to drip irrigation. And cap off any irrigation heads you're not going to use. Or if you're not going to irrigate the space at all, then cap them all. One note I want to point here, and this is in fire-prone areas, it is recommended that you not sheet mulch or any mulch. Sheet mulch or any mulch is not recommended in the 5-foot range of the structure. Use your best judgment in the 5 to 30-foot range, but they've proven that if you don't have any mulch or any woody material in that first 5 feet, it reduces your fire risk tremendously. Step 2, grading and edging. You want to remove the first 8 to 12 inches of lawn that's against any hardscape. And primarily you're doing this to prevent the runoff of the mulch. So when you're putting the mulch on, it kind of goes up to the hardscape instead of going onto the hardscape. And hardscape is anything concrete, any pathways, any decomposed granite. It's the space that you're not sheet mulching, basically. The soil should be between 3 and 6 inches below the hardscape level. And you can do a gradual slope or bevel trench, or just a straight trench, just depends on what kind of shovel you're using. You use these pieces that you've removed you flip them over and kind of create some mounding to highlight future plantings, maybe an accent tree, and create different levels so that your perennials are not all flat. You have different levels there. So you can use that mulch still in place, or use that lawn that you've dug up in place, and it can become part of the mulch that you're building up. So once you've got everything kind of prepped, if you feel the need, you can plant any large trees or large shrubs at this point. Ideally, it's best not to do this at all. I mean, let the sheet mulching process go for 4 to 6 months before you do any planting, because if you plant and sheet mulch at the same time, you're kind of creating cross purposes. You're trying to kill something and get something to grow simultaneously. And the water is being used to help the decomposition, so therefore the plants aren't being able to use it as much. So it's ideally not the best to do, but sometimes some HOAs, some people don't have patience, and some of the water rebate programs require that you plant within a certain period of time. So if that's the case, your larger plants could be planted now because they'll be underneath the level of the sheet mulching. You want to dig the holes at least 2 times wider and about 7/8 the depth of the root ball, and fill back with native soil, not compost or anything like that, because you've got plenty of that in the container. You want to make sure these plants are soaked really, really well before you put them into the ground, just because you want to keep them from going through shock and such, because with all the layers and such, they're not necessarily going to get as much moisture to start. So it's a good idea to make sure they're well watered before you put them in the ground. So the next step 4, is to apply the barrier. On a windless day, preferably, because there's nothing more frustrating than trying to put cardboard down when it's windy, or worse, 5 to 8 sheets of newspaper. So if you put cardboard or newspaper, recycled materials, you want to make sure it's not glossy. You don't want to make sure that it doesn't have a wax layer to the cardboard or such if possible. But you want to put this over the lawn, overlapping at least 8 inches. Kind of like shingles. You can see that in the picture there. Make sure there are no gaps or holes. If you're laying the sheeting around plants, make sure that they kind of stay at least a foot away from the stem, the plant stems or the trunk. And then even further if they're plants that spread via underground stems and such. But lightly sprinkle the barrier material as you're going along. It keeps it from blowing away. Some people will actually use staples on some of this too. That's kind of up to you whether or not you want that extra work or not. But once you sprinkle it, you want to be careful about stepping on it because then you may tear it. And if you tear it, then you want to put another piece of material over the top to cover that hole. Once the barrier is applied and you've wet it down, you want to install irrigation. Again, this is a step that depends on what your plans are. Especially if you've installed plants in step 3, you obviously want to make sure you have irrigation for watering those plants. If you're going to do a drip grid system, so kind of what we show here where you can kind of see there's irrigation lines being put across in a grid system every 2 feet to water the soil. Both of those, you can install that just above the cardboard. And obviously make sure as you're doing it that you're carefully walking on top of the cardboard or the barrier material and not ripping it because you may have to repair those holes. Even if you're not installing the plants immediately, it's probably a good idea to at the very least get those decide where the drip irrigation is going to come from. At the very least, maybe put an octet there, or you put your connections in place so that you can find it easily when you do go to do plants. If you did install plants in step 3, you can install the point drip system either here or just under the mulch. But either way, it just make sure you have access to your irrigation if you're going to be using it for the system or for the planting area. Applying a layer of compost. This is kind of optional. It depends on how soon you're planting. If you planted non-natives in step 3 or planning on planting a bunch of non-natives, then spreading 1 to 2 inches of compost directly over the barrier kind of speeds up the process a bit and gets a little bit more life into the soil to start. The amount of compost you would put in is the area to be covered times 0.16, which is the equivalent of 2 inches. And then that amount divided by 27, which comes out to the cubic yardage of compost you would need to cover the space. So if it was 500 square foot plot, you would need 3 yards of compost to cover that area. This step's not required. It's a nice to have. If you planted natives, it's not required at all because they don't need the extra compost. And I mean, it's a good idea if it was a dead lawn and the area was all dead and there's kind of no soil life there. This kind of adds a little soil life so that as the things are decomposing, there's a little bit extra help, for lack of a better term. Step 7 is to apply the wood chips and the mulch. You want to spread 3 to 5 inches of mulch consisting of wood chips, leaves, chip plant material over the whole space. The amount of mulch is the area to be covered, again, times 0.33, which is the equivalent of 4 inches, divided by 27 to come up with the cubic yard of mulch. So in that same example as before, if it's a 500 square foot of plot, if you're going to put 4 inches of mulch on the top, it'd be about 6 yards. It'd be 9 1/4 yards if you're putting 5 inches, and 5 yards if you're only putting 3. But the more mulch you put on, the more likely things are going to decompose faster. If you put a really thin layer, it's going to take a lot longer for things to break down. One thing that's critical is not to pile that mulch or materials up against existing tree trunks or stems of plants. You want to make sure it stays back at least 12 to 8 inches as need be. And then you're going to want to water the area thoroughly. And as I said, the water hastens the decomposition process, especially if it's done midsummer. Now, you can get to here, water it once and walk away. And in about 6 or so months, you'll come in and it'll probably have broken down. But especially if you start this midsummer, you're going to need to put some water to really get the decomposition activated and moving forward. You don't have to water every day. I mean, it's just a good idea to water at least once or twice a week. I mean, as I said, the more you water, the faster it breaks down. But the water is part of that process. If you do this in the fall, a lot of times the thought process is that the rain will take care of that, the water that's necessary. But if you're doing this midsummer, which in this case, if you were doing it now, that would be the case, you do have to water it periodically, but definitely not as much as you would water a lot. This is kind of a diagram of what it kind of, this is referred to as lasagna mulch for this reason, because you end up with the soil is one layer, the weeds and grass and the green layer on top of that. And then you have your barrier, you have your compost, and then you have your mulch. And so it just kind of, it creates a lasagna effect. And that's why a lot of people refer to this as lasagna mulching. This is some pictures of a sheet mulching process that project we did. We had at the Livermore demo garden, we already had the rest of the space done. This was actually part of the garden for the building that's next door for the field office, but they weren't doing anything with it. It was just getting filled with weeds. So I asked if we could take it over. So we sheet mulched it and documented for purposes like this. So we cleared the larger weeds. That's what step one. You can kind of see us clearing the weeds, watering it down. We created the edge to keep the mulch from going over the side. We applied the barrier and then applied the compost and wood chips. And the reason why, I mean, these are the steps listed here are the steps as discussed in the presentation. We didn't do step 3, i.e. pre-planting, or step 5, installing irrigation, because this was going to be a dry garden. Step 8 is the plant. So ideally you would wait 4 to 6 months and should only be done from fall through early spring. Once you are ready to plant, the 4-inch plants can be planted directly into the compost on top of the barrier. But for the 1-gallon plants, you can push back the mulch, cut away the paper as need be. I mean, if it's starting to decompose, you might be able to just put your shovel straight through it. With the circle wide enough to dig your hole. Make sure that the plants are, again, soaked really well before you put them in the ground. I usually recommend that you take your 1-gallon plants and kind of submerge them in a 5-gallon bucket till the bubbles stop. That fills all of the air pockets with water, so that when they go into the ground, it drains out and the plant has a lot better success rate. You would backfill the plant with native soil and form a slight rim kind of between the paper and the mulch and the plant material itself. The soil should be kept damp for the first 2 weeks of this planting. I mean, whether that's every day or every other day, depending when you're planting. Watering should be spread out to every other day for about 2 to 10 weeks or until it starts raining. If we have a dry spell during the winter, it is always a good idea to do some periodic watering to make sure those plants have sufficient water to get themselves established. The following season, you can extend the watering out to once to twice a week or less frequently, depending on what your requirements are once the plants have been established. If you're using native plants, it can take up to 2 years before the native plants are established enough to be able to cut the water off completely. And this is actually what the garden that we sheet mulched a couple years ago looks like now. We actually just planted it a couple months ago, and it's now a succulent garden that will get hand watered once a month when we have our work days out there, and that's it. So, I mean, it's a great way to convert a weed patch to a beautiful garden. So which location is sheet mulching not appropriate or effective? Over a Bermuda grass lawn, a dead lawn, or with a lot of woody weeds within the first 5 feet of a structure in fire-prone areas, an old veggie garden, both A and C. Got both A and C, but it's not ideal over a Bermuda grass or nutgrass lawn, and it is not recommended whatsoever in the first 5 feet of a structure or fire-prone area. The next question, what activates the decomposition process? What activates the decomposition process more than anything else? Compost, cardboard, water, or mulch? You got it. Yes, the water is the most important part of this. The water is what activates the life within the soil that makes everything else become the compost. The next question is, what are the major benefits of sheet mulching? It avoids the added torn out lawn being added to the landfill, avoids personal labor of tearing out the lawn, keeps the nitrogen and the lawn and plant material on site, and building the soil structure instead of destroying it. Yeah, you guys were all listening. Great. So I believe Lorena's gonna tabulate the questions that you have in the chat box.
Okay, so we have several questions. Would sheet mulching work for blackberries? And I'm going to combine it with another lady's question about ivy that's been there for 40 years and it's in a sloped yard. So would sheet mulching work for these areas?
On the blackberries is listed as one of the places that's not the greatest place to put them. I mean, I guess it depends. The one thing with blackberries is it depends on how woody they are. If you chop them all down and cover them, it could keep the blackberries down, but blackberries are pretty invasive, and so it's not ideal. And with ivy, it's something similar. Although I have found it pretty effective on ivy, it's just you would basically have to mow the ivy down significantly, and kind of like the Bermuda grass, it would take a lot more effort, a lot more material to do. So it's probably, both of those aren't the greatest locations, but they would work. The point about the slope though, you would probably, while you can use sheet mulching on slopes, you would almost need to create slight berms to keep the mulch from sliding all the way down, because the cardboard is going to be a slippery surface. I mean, if you water it down, the mulch will stay, but you would probably want to create slight berms to keep the mulch from sliding down. And that's probably as critical as anything, because otherwise what ends up happening is all the mulch ends up at the bottom, and the top is not going to get covered as much.
Very good. The participant has a garden path and it's full of weeds, and they may want to plant a ground cover there, or they may need to, they may want to add flagstone. So they want to know how to do this sheet mulching for that pathway.
With sheet mulching, you're putting cardboard and you're putting mulch on top of it to try and suffocate the weeds out. If you're planning on putting a pathway on top of that, you can, I mean, you can dig it down and or you can put it there and put the flagstones on top. But if you actually were planning on digging that space out, it may make more sense not to. I mean, I have used newspaper and cardboard under rock. It's not going to have the same effect, but it does keep the weeds down for several years. So it is a way, if you're putting more of a gravel path down, you could put the rock on top. It's just not going to have I wouldn't plant into it because you're not going to have all the things that are going to be bringing that, the good stuff.
What happens if you don't put the compost?
It becomes, I mean, it just takes a little bit longer. That's all. I mean, the compost isn't necessary at all, because the whole process actually creates compost. And if it was a dead plot before and you just put the cardboard down and you put the mulch down, you may have to water a little bit more to get things kind of started. But the compost is actually, as I said, if your plan is to plant natives in that space, then compost actually is not recommended at all. Depending on which directions you read, a lot of them don't even include compost as one of the steps. It's just if you're planning on planting in the near future, it sometimes is and it was like a dead lawn or a wheat patch beforehand and there wasn't a whole lot of soil life there, the compost may make it a little bit more conducive to new plants. But if you're not going to be planting in a longer period of time, there'll be plenty of compost in the 4 to 6 month time frame.
There's a question regarding the ivy on the sloped yard. She says, what alternatives do you recommend for removing the ivy?
I usually just weed whack it back, and if you do it enough time, I mean, and that's why I said it may work from the perspective if you weed whack it back and cover it, it will slow it down. Ivy, as everybody knows, I mean, the smallest little piece can start, but if it's under a thick layer of things, the ivy tends to not want to compete. It shows up everywhere, but it also somewhat lazy from that perspective. So it would be a way to just chop it way back and just continuously do that, and eventually and put a thick layer of mulch down, and it could potentially make the ivy go away.
Good, thank you, Carol. We have another question about adding river rock on top of the compost mulch layer for the purpose of keeping it in place around the street tree plot, and then later remove the rocks when it's ready to plant.
Yeah, I mean, you could, I mean, if you want to, especially if you're like around the street tree, you want to kind of have, you could use river rock to kind of create that space, keep it away from the tree. I mean, you can have the river rock in there. It's not going to decompose, obviously. So when you go to plant, it's potentially going to be in the way. But if you're just moving it out of the way, but yeah, using it for keeping the mulch itself will keep the bark down. I've used river rock also along the edge of some of the hardscape, or as you said, to keep the mulch from encroaching upon. Yes, you can use it for that as just kind of as a barrier. Yeah, that can be done, and it's not going to hurt anything.
Okay, very good. Let's see. Someone asked a question, could they just use landscape paper instead of cardboard, I think.
Well, I think landscape paper is cardboard that they have, or if you're talking about weed cloth is not going to work. Weed cloth doesn't actually decompose. The whole point of doing, so I'm not sure the term landscape paper, if you're referring to the cardboard rolls out there that get sold, they're basically, instead of using recycled cardboard, you're just basically buying cardboard to put down, which has its pluses and minuses. And if you're as I said, if you're talking about weed cloth is not going to work at all, because weed cloth basically is going to create a barrier between the mulch and the soil, and it's going to be just the opposite of cause more problems. So
Right.
No, we recommend using weed cloth, but you can use cardboard.
And if you want the East Bay rebate, they do not want you to be using any type of weed barrier.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, weed cloth actually, I mean, it may resolve some problems in the short term, but it causes a lot of problems in the long term. It basically ends up being something you have to deal with within a year or so, and it doesn't prevent the weeds long term.
And we have one more question. This person has a front lawn with 2 big trees that drops a lot of leaves every fall. So what do you recommend doing to manage the leaves? This is a front lawn.
I personally, the leaves are part of the mulch. So, I mean, it's just part of the whole process. If the leaves are going to bother you, I mean, and the way you've been dealing with those leaves is to mow them up in your lawn, then sheet mulching may not be the perfect choice for you. If you use natural wood chips and such, I mean, the leaves will start to, will be hidden, but yes, they're going to be there. They're mulch. They're actually part of the whole process. I would just leave them in place personally.
Okay, so we have this question about soil, and I think it is pertinent. This person has very solid clay in their backyard, and it's not good for planting. Do you have a suggestion? Do you have a better alternative, or will sheet mulching be good for this?
Well, sheet mulching will help break it down. I mean, clay soil is actually not bad for planting. It's just very dense. And what the sheet mulching will do is actually kind of break up some of that for you. That's kind of the whole point of sheet mulching. Sheet mulching, once you decomposes things, it will actually break down the soil that's below it and will actually make it more effective for you to be able to plant in long term.
This person is questioning about cover crops. Should they plant cover crops, then mow it as it dies, and then do the sheet mulching?
You can. I mean, it's an extra step. I mean, the cover crops basically are, if it was a dead lot or plot or something that's been depleted because of the plants that were there before were very needy, a cover crop would kind of add that extra layer of nutrients. But it'd be kind of the equivalent of planting. I mean, in all intents and purposes, lawn's a cover crop. It's just something that uses way too much water, and we harvest it and then throw it away. So, if you already had a cover crop and then sheet mulch, but planting a cover crop before you sheet mulch, it's not a bad thing. It's just, I don't know if it's necessary.
There's a question about sheet mulching for pathways between the raised garden.
So that was what I was discussing before. It's kind of a half sheet mulching. It's not, if you're just using it as basically a decomposing weed cloth, yes, it can be done. I've done it in several of my gardens where I have put newspaper or cardboard down and then put rock on top of it, and it breaks down after a while, but it keeps the weeds down. But it does break down. So in a few years or whatever, you may have weeds coming through. The true sheet mulching is supposed to be for building up the soil. So it's for making it a space suitable for planting. So the sheet mulching itself for pathways, you're kind of doing the opposite of what it's for.
Okay, very good. Okay, we're getting more and more questions here. One is, would the wood chips bring ants?
No more than anything else will.
Okay.
Yes, it could if you already have if the wood chips you bring in have ants in them, or if you already have ants in your soil, it will give them something more to live in, but it's not going to necessarily attract ants. It just depends on the materials you're bringing in.
Okay. Oh, here's some more questions coming in. Okay.
So
this lady has a sprinkler system, and if she does the solarization process, will it interrupt use of it? Do I need to redo the sprinkler system afterwards?
If you have a sprinkler system, so you have a lawn and you have spray sprinklers around it, you would not use spray sprinklers per se when you would on the plant in the new garden. What you would do is you would designate which of those sprinklers you're going to use to convert over to drip irrigation. Then you would cap off the sprinklers that you're not going to use. You don't have to redo anything. It's not going to, destroy the sprinkler system. You'll be covering some of it, but that's why I said during the prep phase that you would cap off any sprinklers you wouldn't be using, and then the ones you will be, I mean, the ones you're going to use as supply points for your drip system, you would make sure that you flag where those are so that you know where to connect your drip system to when you're ready to plant.
Thank you.